Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her rifle scope one final time as the morning Afghan sun cast long shadows across the mountainous terrain. The forward operating base buzzed with the usual pre-mission activity, but today felt different. Today, she would finally get her chance to prove herself to the most elite sniper team in the battalion. The 82nd Airborne's premier sniper squad had arrived at FOB Lightning 3 days earlier, and their reputation preceded them like a storm cloud. Led by Master Sergeant Jake Morrison, these 5 men had accumulated more confirmed kills than any other team in the division. They carried themselves with the swagger that only comes from being the absolute best at what you do, and they made sure everyone knew it. Maria had been assigned as their spotter, a role that stung more than she cared to admit. She had graduated top of her class from sniper school, earned expert marksman badges in multiple weapon systems, and had already logged 37 confirmed kills during her 18 months in Afghanistan. But when the brass needed someone to work with Morrison's team, they chose her not for her shooting ability, but for her exceptional skills with range-finding equipment and wind calculation. The decision rankled her, especially when she overheard the conversations that Morrison's team thought they were having privately. They called her the calculator behind her back, treating her like a piece of advanced equipment rather than a fellow warrior. Morrison himself had made it clear on their first day together that he expected her to stay in her lane, handle the numbers, and leave the real shooting to the professionals. "Santos, quit daydreaming and get those range cards updated," Morrison barked from across the preparation area. His tone carried the casual dismissiveness she had grown accustomed to over the past 3 days. "We're moving out to Ridge 7 in 20 minutes, and I don't want any delays because someone couldn't handle basic math." Maria bit back her response and focused on her equipment. Morrison's team was gathering around a table covered with satellite photographs and topographical maps, discussing their next mission with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Sergeant First Class Tommy Chen, Morrison's regular spotter, was describing the target area with animated gestures. "Intelligence says we've got a high-value target holed up in this compound," Chen explained, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley approximately 4,000 meters from their planned shooting position. "Local Taliban commander who's been coordinating IED attacks on convoy routes. Command wants him taken out before he can slip away again." Specialist Mike Rodriguez, the team's backup sniper, leaned over the map with a grin. 4 clicks. That's barely a warm-up shot. I could make that hit with my sidearm." The other team members chuckled at Rodriguez's joke, but Maria noticed the underlying truth in their casual confidence. These men had made shots at extreme ranges that most snipers could only dream about. Morrison himself held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill in the battalion at 4,200 meters, a shot that had become legendary among the troops. Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy, another team member, glanced over at Maria with barely concealed amusement. "Hope our math genius here can keep up with some real long-range work. This isn't shooting paper targets at a training range." Maria felt her jaw tighten, but maintained her professional composure. She had dealt with this attitude her entire military career, from basic training through advanced schools and operational deployments. Being one of the few women in combat arms meant constantly proving herself, and she had learned to let her performance speak louder than any words could. "Range cards are complete," she reported crisply, handing Morrison the detailed calculations for wind drift, bullet drop, and environmental factors. Her numbers were always precise, and even Morrison's team had grudgingly admitted that her calculations were flawless. Morrison glanced at her work and nodded curtly. "Good enough. Load up, we're moving out." The helicopter ride to Ridge 7 took 45 minutes, flying nap of the earth to avoid detection. Maria used the time to study the terrain they would be working in, mentally calculating shooting angles and identifying potential challenges. The ridge offered excellent observation over the target valley, but it also presented some unique difficulties that she doubted Morrison's team had fully considered. As they established their hide site on the rocky outcrop, Maria began setting up her spotting scope while Morrison and his team prepared their primary weapon system, a 50 caliber Barrett rifle that could deliver devastating accuracy at extreme ranges. The other team members spread out to establish security and backup positions, their movements precise and professional despite their attitude. The target compound lay in the distance like a brown smudge against the mountainous landscape. Through her high-powered scope, Maria could see the buildings clearly, noting the defensive positions and likely escape routes. Intelligence was right about this being a well-fortified position, and she understood why Command wanted to eliminate the threat from long range rather than risk a direct assault. Range to target building is 4,147 meters, Maria reported after completing her initial calculations. Wind is variable, currently 7 miles per hour from the southwest, but there's a thermal layer about halfway to target that could affect bullet trajectory. Morrison settled behind his rifle and peered through his scope. Copy that. I can see the thermal shimmer you're talking about. Shouldn't be a problem for a shot this straightforward. For the next 3 hours, they waited and observed. The target area remained quiet, with only occasional movement from what appeared to be guards or sentries. Morrison's team maintained their professional focus, but Maria could sense their growing impatience. They were accustomed to quick missions with clear shots, not extended surveillance operations. Around midday, Chen spotted movement in the main building. I've got someone moving around the north window, second floor. Could be our guy. Morrison adjusted his position and studied the target through his scope. Negative. Wrong body type, and the clothing doesn't match the intel photos. We wait for positive identification. The afternoon wore on with increasing heat and decreasing patience from Morrison's team. Maria continued monitoring environmental conditions, updating her calculations as wind patterns shifted and thermal layers moved across the valley. Her training had taught her that successful long-range shooting was as much about patience and preparation as it was about trigger control. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, their target appeared. The Taliban commander emerged from the main building and walked toward what appeared to be a communications setup on the roof. Through her scope, Maria could clearly see his face, and it matched the intelligence photographs perfectly. Target confirmed, Morrison announced quietly. Range 4,347 meters, target is stationary on the rooftop. Wind? Maria quickly recalculated the environmental factors. Wind has shifted to 8 miles per hour from the west. Thermal layer is more pronounced now due to afternoon heating. Recommend adjusting elevation 2 clicks up and windage 3 clicks right. Morrison made the adjustments and settled into his shooting position. The Barrett's massive barrel pointed across the valley like an accusing finger. Maria watched through her spotting scope, ready to call the shot and provide immediate feedback for a follow-up if necessary. Firing! Morrison announced. The rifle's report echoed across the mountains like thunder. Maria tracked the bullet's path through her scope, watching for the telltale signs of impact. After what seemed like an eternity but was actually less than 6 seconds, she saw dust kick up from the building's wall, well to the right of where the target had been standing. Miss, she reported professionally. Impact approximately 2 meters right of target. Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. In front of his team, with a female spotter calling his miss, the legendary sniper had failed to make what should have been a routine shot for someone of his reputation. Check your math again, he snapped, working his rifle's bolt to chamber another round. Those calculations must be wrong. Maria had already rechecked her numbers twice, but she verified them once more. Calculations are accurate, Sergeant. Wind conditions remain the same. Target is still stationary. Morrison fired again, and again Maria called the miss. This time the bullet struck the building's roof, close to the target but not close enough. The Taliban commander had noticed the impacts and was moving toward cover. Target is moving, Maria reported. He's heading for the stairwell on the east side of the building. Morrison fired a third shot, this time missing entirely as the target disappeared into the building's interior. The opportunity was lost, and the mission was effectively over. In a matter of minutes, the most elite sniper team in the battalion had failed to eliminate a stationary target under ideal conditions. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's team members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their confusion and disappointment. Their leader, the man they looked up to and followed without question, had just missed 3 consecutive shots at a range that should have been well within his capabilities. "Equipment malfunction," Morrison finally declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "Something's wrong with this rifle's Zero." Maria knew better than to contradict him directly, but she also knew that the rifle was functioning perfectly. She had watched Morrison check and recheck his weapon before the mission, and his first shot had been close enough to confirm that the equipment was working properly. The problem wasn't mechanical, it was something more fundamental. As they packed up their equipment for extraction, Maria found herself studying the target area one more time through her spotting scope. The math in her head was working overtime, recalculating angles and distances, wind drift, and bullet drop. Something about this shot bothered her, something that Morrison's team had missed in their confidence and experience. The helicopter ride back to base was subdued. Morrison stared out the window with barely controlled frustration, while his team members sat in uncomfortable silence. They had built their reputation on precision and reliability, and today's failure would follow them until they could redeem themselves. Back at Fob Lightning, word of the missed shots spread quickly through the base's tight-knit community. Morrison's team tried to maintain their usual swagger, but Maria could see the cracks forming in their confidence. Other soldiers who had previously looked up to them with something approaching reverence now watched with curiosity and mild amusement. That evening, Maria sat alone in the equipment bay, studying the ballistic tables and environmental data from the day's mission. Her laptop screen glowed in the dim light as she ran calculation after calculation, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Morrison's adjustments had been correct based on her initial readings, but something had interfered with the bullet's path. She pulled up the meteorological data for the region and began comparing it with the thermal imaging from their spotting scopes. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The thermal layer she had noticed was more complex than she had initially calculated, creating a series of air density changes that would affect long-range ballistics in subtle but significant ways. More importantly, she realized that the shooting position on Ridge 7 offered a clear line of sight to a different target area, one that Morrison's team had dismissed as too distant to be relevant. Through the valley and over a series of smaller ridges lay another compound, this one nearly 5,000 meters away. Intelligence reports had mentioned it as a possible secondary location, but Morrison had focused entirely on the closer target. Maria spent the next hour running calculations for a hypothetical shot at the distant compound. The mathematics were complex, requiring her to account for multiple thermal layers, varying wind conditions across nearly 3 miles of terrain, and the Coriolis effect that became significant at such extreme ranges. But as she worked through the numbers, she began to realize that such a shot might actually be possible. The next morning, Morrison's team prepared for another attempt at the original target. Intelligence indicated that the Taliban commander would likely return to the nearer compound, and this time, Morrison was determined to make the shot. His pride was on the line, and everyone on base knew it. As they prepared their equipment, Maria approached Morrison with her calculations from the previous evening. "Sergeant, I've been analyzing yesterday's conditions, and I think there might be another opportunity." Morrison barely looked up from his rifle maintenance. "Save it, Santos. I know what went wrong yesterday, and it won't happen again." "There's another compound at 4,967 meters," Maria continued, despite his dismissive tone. "Intelligence mentions it as a secondary location, and the shooting conditions might actually be more favorable from our position." This got the attention of Chen and Rodriguez, who looked up from their gear with skeptical expressions. Rodriguez laughed outright. Almost 5,000 meters? You're talking about a shot that's never been made in combat conditions. That's fantasy land stuff. Morrison finally looked at Maria directly, his expression somewhere between annoyed and amused. Let me explain something to you, Santos. Making shots at that range isn't about math and calculations. It takes years of experience, instinct, and skills that can't be taught in a classroom. Stick to what you know. Maria felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest, but she kept her voice level. I understand the complexity, Sergeant, but the calculations show it's theoretically possible, and if there's intelligence value in that secondary compound... The answer is no, Morrison cut her off. We're going back to complete yesterday's mission, and I don't want to hear any more about impossible shots and theoretical mathematics. As the team loaded into the helicopter for their return to Ridge 7, Maria found herself questioning everything she had trained for. Her calculations were solid. Her understanding of long-range ballistics was as good as anyone in the military, but she was still seen as nothing more than a glorified calculator by the people she was supposed to support. The flight to the ridge was routine, but Maria's mind was racing with possibilities. She had run the numbers for the distant shot dozens of times, accounting for every variable she could think of. The mathematics were challenging but not impossible, and something deep in her gut told her that the opportunity was real. Once they were back in position on Ridge 7, Morrison's team focused their attention on the original target compound. The Taliban commander had indeed returned, and this time Morrison was determined to make the shot that would restore his reputation and his team's confidence. But as Maria set up her spotting scope, she couldn't help but turn her attention to the distant compound that had occupied her thoughts all night. Through her high-powered optics, she could see activity there as well, movement that suggested the location was more important than intelligence had initially assessed. And then she saw something that changed everything. Through her scope, she spotted a figure moving between buildings at the distant compound, someone whose build and movement patterns looked remarkably similar to a high-value target they had been briefed on weeks earlier. If she was right, the person in her scope was worth 10 times more than the local commander they were currently targeting. Maria felt her heart rate increase as she watched the distant figure. This was the opportunity she had been preparing for her entire career, the moment when her mathematical precision and shooting skills could come together to make a difference. But she also knew that Morrison would never authorize such a shot, not when his reputation was already on the line from yesterday's failures. She glanced over at Morrison, who was settling into position behind his Barrett rifle, completely focused on the nearer target. His team was spread out in their security positions, confident that today would redeem yesterday's embarrassment. None of them were paying attention to her or her spotting scope. Maria made a decision that would change everything. Maria Santos quietly reached for her personal rifle, a precision weapon she had been carrying but never been allowed to use on mission. While Morrison and his team focused entirely on their primary target, she began calculating the most complex shooting solution of her career. The distant compound sat nearly 5,000 meters away, a target that would require every bit of skill and knowledge she possessed. The figure she had spotted was still moving between buildings, and she had perhaps minutes before the opportunity disappeared forever. Working with practiced efficiency, Maria began inputting data into her range-finding equipment. Distance, 4,967 meters. Elevation difference, 347 meters down from her position. Wind speed varying from 8 miles per hour at her location to potentially 12 miles per hour in the valley, then decreasing to around 6 miles per hour at the target area. The complexity was staggering. At this range, she had to account for the Earth's rotation, air pressure differences across nearly 3 miles of terrain, temperature variations between the ridge and the valley floor, and multiple thermal layers that would bend her bullet's path in subtle but critical ways. Her fingers moved quickly across her ballistic computer, inputting variables that Morrison's team would have dismissed as unnecessarily complex: barometric pressure, humidity levels, powder temperature, even the slight difference in gravitational pull at various elevations. Each factor was small individually, but at 5,000 meters, small errors became massive misses. Morrison's voice cut through her concentration. Target is stationary on the north building rooftop. Prepare to engage. Maria glanced over at the master sergeant as he settled behind his rifle. He was focused completely on the nearer target, just as his team expected him to be. None of them were watching her as she made final adjustments to her own weapon and shooting position. The mathematics racing through her head were unlike anything she had calculated in training. The bullet would travel for nearly 6 seconds before impact, covering almost 3 miles of varied terrain. During that time, wind conditions could shift, thermal layers could move, and her target could walk away from the impact point. She had one chance, maybe two if she was lucky, before Morrison's team would notice what she was doing. Her heart hammered in her chest as she settled into a shooting position that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Every training exercise had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the pressure of attempting something that had never been done in combat. Through her scope, the distant target appeared impossibly small. Even at maximum magnification, the figure looked like little more than a dot moving against the brown buildings. Traditional sniper doctrine said this shot was impossible. The experts would call it a waste of ammunition, a foolish attempt that only served to reveal their position to the enemy. But Maria's calculations told a different story. The wind conditions were actually favorable for such an extreme shot, with relatively consistent patterns across the valley. The thermal layers were stable due to the late morning temperature, and the target area was well defined against the lighter-colored buildings. She checked her rifle one final time. The weapon was zeroed perfectly, having been tested and retested during her months in country. Her ammunition was match grade, carefully selected for consistency and accuracy. Everything was as ready as it could possibly be. "Firing," Morrison announced as he prepared to engage his target. Maria used the sound of Morrison's shot as cover for chambering her own round. The bolt action was smooth and quiet, but she timed it perfectly with the Barrett's massive report. Morrison's bullet sailed across the valley toward the nearer compound, while Maria continued her final calculations. "Miss. 2 meters left," she called out professionally while watching Morrison's impact through her spotting scope. But her attention was split between her spotting duties and her own shot preparation. She could see Morrison's frustration building as he worked his bolt for a second shot. His team was starting to question their equipment and their calculations, but none of them suspected what was happening just a few meters away. Maria's crosshairs settled on the distant target with mathematical precision. Her breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm, each exhale bringing her closer to the moment of truth. The wind readings across the valley were as stable as she could hope for, and her target had paused near the center of the main building. The physics involved were staggering. Her bullet would drop more than 40 feet during its flight, requiring her to aim at what appeared to be empty sky above her actual target. Wind drift would push the projectile nearly 8 feet to the right, demanding an aim point that seemed completely disconnected from where she wanted the bullet to strike. Morrison fired his second shot, and again, Maria called the miss while maintaining her position behind her own rifle. The master sergeant was becoming increasingly agitated, his confidence shaken by consecutive failures in front of his team and their female spotter. Maria's finger found the trigger of her rifle with the familiarity born of thousands of practice repetitions. The pressure required was exactly 2.5 pounds, and she had trained until that pressure was as natural as breathing. But this time was different. This time, everything she had worked for came down to a single trigger pull. The mathematical certainty in her head warred with the physical impossibility of what she was attempting. 5,000 meters was beyond the effective range of most artillery systems, let alone a single rifle shot. The target was barely visible even through her high-powered scope, and dozens of environmental factors could cause a miss. but her calculations were perfect, her equipment was flawless, and her position was as stable as any she had ever achieved. Most importantly, her target had stopped moving and was standing in the ideal position for her predetermined impact point. Maria's finger began its slow, steady pressure on the trigger. Her breathing stopped completely, her heartbeat seemed to pause. And the entire world narrowed down to the mathematical relationship between her rifle and a target nearly 3 miles away. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that was instantly swallowed by the vastness of the Afghan mountains. Through her scope, Maria tracked the muzzle flash and began the longest 6 seconds of her career, watching for an impact that might never come. Morrison was preparing for his third shot when Maria's bullet began its incredible journey across the valley. The projectile followed a precise ballistic arc that had been calculated to the fraction of an inch, rising high above the intervening terrain before beginning its long descent toward the distant compound. Thermal layers bent the bullet's path slightly, just as Maria had predicted. Wind currents nudged it to the left and right as it traveled through different pressure zones, but her calculations had accounted for these forces. The Earth's rotation imparted a subtle curve to the trajectory, pulling the bullet in a direction that defied common sense but followed the laws of physics exactly. Maria watched through her scope with professional intensity, counting the seconds and waiting for confirmation of impact. At this range, even a perfect shot would be difficult to observe, and atmospheric distortion made visual confirmation challenging under the best conditions. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Morrison fired his third shot at the nearer target just as Maria's bullet completed its incredible journey. The timing was pure coincidence, but it meant that 2 rifle reports echoed across the valley simultaneously, masking what had just occurred. Through her scope, Maria saw a small puff of dust from the distant building, so subtle that she almost missed it. But the figure that had been standing near the main entrance was no longer visible, and her trained eye caught the telltale signs of a successful impact. "Miss, target has moved to cover," she reported automatically, referring to Morrison's shot while her heart pounded with the possibility of what she had just achieved. Morrison slammed his hand against the ground in frustration. 3 consecutive misses had destroyed his reputation and his team's confidence. The master sergeant, who had been legendary for his precision, had failed completely at a range he had shot successfully dozens of times before. "Something's wrong with this whole setup," Morrison muttered angrily. "Equipment, calculations, something's not right." Maria continued watching the distant compound through her scope, looking for confirmation of what she believed she had accomplished. The building where her target had been standing remained quiet, with no movement visible around the impact area. But at this range, visual confirmation was nearly impossible under normal circumstances. 20 minutes later, their radio crackled with an urgent transmission from base intelligence. "Lightning 7, this is base intelligence. We're receiving SIGINT reports of a high-value target down at grid reference 42 SMD 23847 1FEEN 394. Can you confirm any activity in that area? Over." Maria felt her blood turn to ice as she quickly plotted the grid reference on her map. The coordinates corresponded exactly to the distant compound where she had taken her impossible shot. Someone at the secondary location was dead, and intelligence assets were picking up communications about it. "Lightning 7. Negative activity observed at that reference," Morrison replied after checking his own map. He was focused entirely on their primary target area and had no idea what the coordinates actually represented. Maria stared at the radio with growing realization. Her shot had not only connected, but it had eliminated someone important enough that enemy communications were buzzing with reports of his death. The figure she had spotted through her scope had been exactly who she thought it was. For the next hour, Morrison's team continued their unsuccessful attempts to engage their original target. The Taliban commander at the nearer compound had learned caution from the earlier shots and refused to expose himself for more than a few seconds at a time. Morrison's confidence was completely shattered, and his team was beginning to question everything they had believed about their abilities. Meanwhile, Maria processed what she had accomplished with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had made a shot that military experts would have called impossible, eliminating a target at a range that exceeded every record in the books. And she had done it while serving as a spotter for men who considered her nothing more than a calculator. The radio transmission that confirmed everything came 3 hours later. Lightning 7. This is base intelligence with updated information. Human assets confirmed that high-value target designation Shepherd was eliminated at approximately 13:47 hours local time at the previously referenced grid coordinates. Please confirm if any friendly forces engage targets in that area. This is a priority intelligence requirement. Over. Morrison looked up from his rifle with confusion. Shepherd was the code name for one of the most wanted terrorist leaders in the entire region, a man responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Intelligence had been hunting him for over 8 months, and now he was suddenly dead at a location that Morrison's team hadn't even been monitoring. Negative base intelligence. We have not engaged any targets at those coordinates. Our assigned target area is approximately 1,500 meters northeast of that position. Over. Maria watched Morrison's face as he tried to process the information. A high-value target was dead in an area that should have been far beyond the range of any weapon his team possessed. The mathematics of the situation didn't make sense from his perspective. Lightning 7, stand by for orders. Higher Command is extremely interested in how this target was eliminated. Continue mission as assigned, but be prepared to provide detailed reports on all activities. Out. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's team exchanged glances that reflected their complete confusion about the situation. Someone had killed one of the most wanted men in Afghanistan from an unknown location using unknown methods, and they were the only friendly forces in the area. Maria felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the mountain air. Her secret was becoming harder to maintain with every radio transmission, but she also knew that revealing what she had done would create problems she wasn't prepared to handle. Specialist Rodriguez was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. How the hell did someone eliminate a target at that range? There's no way anyone could make that shot from this position. Chen pulled out his map and measured the distance to the reported coordinates. That's got to be almost 5,000 meters from here. Nobody shoots that far in combat. It's got to be a mistake, maybe an airstrike or artillery that got misreported. Morrison studied his own map with growing bewilderment. The distances involved were beyond anything he had attempted even in training, and he considered himself one of the best long-range shooters in the military. The idea that someone could eliminate a target at that range with a rifle shot seemed completely impossible. Base intelligence, this is Lightning 7, Morrison transmitted. Can you confirm the method of elimination? Was this an airstrike or indirect fire mission? Over. Lightning 7, negative. All aircraft are accounted for, and no indirect fire missions were conducted in that area. Human reports indicate a single projectile impact consistent with small arms fire. Repeat, this appears to be a rifle shot. Over. The radio fell silent as Morrison's team processed this information. A rifle shot at nearly 5,000 meters was beyond the realm of possibility for anyone they knew. Even the most elite special operations snipers rarely attempted shots beyond 3,000 meters in combat conditions. Maria continued watching the distant compound through her scope, looking for any additional movement or confirmation of what she had accomplished. The building remained quiet, and the absence of activity was itself a form of confirmation that something significant had occurred there. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison's frustration with his own missed shots combined with the mystery of the distant elimination created an atmosphere of tension and confusion among his team. They were supposed to be the elite, the best snipers in the battalion, but they couldn't hit a target at moderate range while someone unknown was apparently making impossible shots in the same area. The final confirmation came just before they prepared to extract from their position. Lightning 7, this is base intelligence with final confirmation. Target Shepard has been confirmed eliminated by high-velocity small arms fire at approximately 13 to 47 hours. Round appears to have been fired from an elevated position to the northeast of target location. Distance estimated at between 4 and 5,000 meters. This represents the longest confirmed elimination in theater. Higher command requires immediate debrief upon your return. Out. Morrison stared at his radio as if it had betrayed him personally. Someone had made the longest shot in the entire war theater from a position that could only be their current location, but his team hadn't fired a single round toward that target area. The helicopter extraction was subdued, with Morrison's team trying to understand how they could have been in the perfect position for a record-breaking shot without knowing anything about it. Maria sat quietly among them, her secret growing heavier with every minute that passed. Back at Fob Lightning, word of the mysterious elimination spread through the base like wildfire. Morrison's team found themselves at the center of speculation and questions they couldn't answer, while Maria quietly secured her rifle and began preparing her own version of the day's events. The debriefing would be tomorrow, and Maria knew she couldn't keep her secret much longer. The mathematics of the shot, the timing of the elimination, and the position of friendly forces made it clear that only one person could have made that incredible shot. But first, she had to decide whether she was ready to face the consequences of proving that the experts could be wrong. The base briefing room felt smaller than usual as Maria Santos sat across from Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the battalion commander, and Major Patricia Wells, the intelligence officer who had been tracking Shepard for 8 months. Morrison's entire team was present, their expressions ranging from confused to frustrated as they prepared to explain what they couldn't understand. Colonel Harrison spread satellite photographs across the conference table, each image marked with precise coordinates and timestamp data. The photos showed the aftermath of yesterday's mission, including the compound where Shepard had been eliminated and the ridge where Morrison's team had been positioned. "Gentlemen, and Sergeant Santos," Harrison began, his tone carrying the weight of someone who needed answers. "We have a situation that defies explanation. Intelligence assets confirm that one of our most wanted targets was eliminated yesterday by what appears to be the longest confirmed sniper shot in military history." Major Wells activated a digital display showing a tactical map of the area. Red lines connected Morrison's position on Ridge 7 to both target compounds, clearly illustrating the distances involved. The line to Shepard's compound stretched across nearly 5,000 meters of mountainous terrain. "The shot appears to have been fired from your position," Wells continued, "but none of you reported engaging targets at that location. The mathematics involved in such a shot are extraordinary, and frankly, most experts would say it's impossible under combat conditions." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His reputation as the battalion's premier sniper was built on shots far shorter than what they were discussing, and the implication that someone had surpassed him by such a massive margin was clearly bothering him. "Ma'am, with respect, my team focused exclusively on our assigned target area," Morrison replied. "We never even considered engaging anything at that range. The distances involved are beyond practical engagement parameters for our equipment and training." Rodriguez nodded agreement. "Even if we had identified a target at that distance, taking such a shot would have been tactically unsound. The probability of success would be minimal, and it would have compromised our primary mission." Maria listened to the discussion while wrestling with her conscience. Every professional instinct told her to remain quiet, to let the mystery remain unsolved rather than face the consequences of revealing what she had done. But another part of her, the part that had endured years of dismissive comments and condescending attitudes, wanted recognition for what might be the greatest shooting achievement of the war. Colonel Harrison studied the ballistic analysis reports that had been prepared overnight. The trajectory analysis is remarkable. Whoever made this shot had to account for multiple thermal layers, varying wind conditions across 3 miles of terrain, and environmental factors that most snipers never consider. The mathematics alone represent graduate-level ballistic computation. Major Wells added, "Intelligence intercepts confirm that Shepard's organization is in complete disarray. He was apparently killed instantly by a single shot to the center of mass from an impossible distance. Enemy forces are attributing it to some kind of new American superweapon or experimental technology." Chen leaned forward with genuine confusion. "Are we sure it wasn't some kind of special operations team that we weren't informed about? Maybe Delta Force or Navy SEALs with specialized equipment?" Harrison shook his head. "Every friendly asset in the region is accounted for. Aircraft logs show no overflights. Artillery records show no fire missions, and Special Operations Command confirms no teams were operating in that area. According to every official record, your team was the only friendly presence within 50 miles of the target." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that no one wanted to voice. Morrison's team was supposed to be the elite, the best shooters the battalion had to offer, but they couldn't explain how someone from their position had made a shot that exceeded their capabilities by orders of magnitude. Maria felt her heart pounding as the moment of truth approached. She could continue to let the mystery stand, allowing others to take credit or blame for what she had accomplished. Or she could step forward and claim ownership of what might be her career's defining moment. The decision was made for her when Colonel Harrison turned directly to her with a question that changed everything. "Sergeant Santos, your ballistic calculations for yesterday's mission were reviewed by our technical experts. The precision and complexity of your environmental analysis far exceeded standard requirements. Did you identify any potential targets beyond your team's assigned area?" Maria's mouth felt dry as she realized that her detailed calculations had been noticed by people who understood their implications. The mathematical work she had done to plan for the distant shot was documented in her mission reports, and someone with expertise had recognized what those numbers actually represented. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. "I identified a secondary compound at 4,167 meters that showed signs of significant activity." Morrison's head snapped toward her with an expression of complete surprise. "You never mentioned any secondary targets during mission planning or execution." Maria met his gaze steadily. "You made it clear that observations outside our assigned area were not welcome, Sergeant. I focused on providing the calculations and spotting services you required." Major Wells was studying Maria with growing interest. "Sergeant Santos, the ballistic calculations found in your personal notes describe a shooting solution for that exact distance. Can you explain why you were working on mathematics for a target your team never intended to engage?" The moment of truth had arrived, and Maria realized that partial honesty would be worse than full disclosure. She took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff and spoke the words that would change everything. "Because I engaged that target myself, ma'am. At 13:47 hours yesterday, I fired one round at the secondary compound and achieved a successful elimination of the target later identified as Shepard." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions from disbelief to anger to something that might have been respect. Chen and Rodriguez looked like they had been hit with a physical blow, while Murphy simply stared at her with his mouth open. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what he had just heard. "Sergeant Santos, are you telling me that while serving as a spotter for Master Sergeant Morrison's team, you independently identified, calculated, and successfully engaged a target at nearly 5,000 meters?" "Yes, sir. I observed what appeared to be a high-value individual at the secondary compound, calculated the ballistic solution, and took the shot while maintaining my spotting duties for the primary mission." Morrison's voice carried a mixture of incredulity and wounded pride. "That's impossible, Santos. Nobody makes shots at that distance. The equipment alone isn't capable of that kind of precision, and the mathematical complexity would require exactly the kind of calculations I do every day as a qualified sniper and advanced ballistic computer. Maria interrupted, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. The same calculations you've been dismissing as unnecessary complexity for the past 3 days. Major Wells was pulling up Maria's training records on her laptop. Sergeant Santos graduated first in her class from sniper school, holds expert marksman qualifications on 7 weapon systems, and has a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics. Her calculated probability of success for the shot in question was 37%. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. Even if she made the shot, 37% means she got lucky. That's not skill. That's a gambling chance that paid off. Maria turned to face Rodriguez directly. 37% was the probability of a first-round hit under combat conditions. In controlled conditions, my calculated probability was over 60%. I took the shot because the mathematics supported success, not because I was gambling with ammunition. Chen was staring at the tactical display with growing comprehension. If what you're saying is true, then you made a shot that exceeds every record in the books, by almost 1,000 meters. Colonel Harrison was reviewing the timeline of events with the precision of someone who understood the implications. Sergeant Santos, the timing of your shot coincided exactly with Master Sergeant Morrison's final attempt at his target. Is that correct? Yes, sir. I used the sound of Sergeant Morrison's shot to mask my own rifle report. The timing was intentional to maintain operational security for the primary mission. Morrison finally spoke, his voice carrying emotions he was clearly struggling to control. Why didn't you tell us what you were planning? Why take that kind of risk without coordination with the team leader? Maria met his eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every dismissive comment and condescending attitude she had endured. Because for 3 days, you made it clear that my role was to provide calculations and keep quiet. You called me the calculator and told me to stay in my lane. When I tried to discuss the secondary target yesterday morning, you told me to stick to what I know and leave the real shooting to the professionals. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Morrison's team exchanged glances that acknowledged the truth of what Maria had said, even if they were uncomfortable with hearing it stated so directly. Major Wells was reviewing intelligence reports with growing excitement. The elimination of Shepard represents one of the biggest intelligence victories of the deployment. His organization was responsible for over 40 coalition casualties, and his death has already disrupted operations across 3 provinces. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. Sergeant Santos, assuming your account is accurate, you've accomplished something that will be studied by military marksmen for decades. But you've also violated protocol by engaging targets without authorization and potentially compromising your team's mission. Maria had expected this moment, and she was ready for it. Sir, I maintained my assigned duties throughout the engagement. My spotting and calculations for the primary mission were never compromised, and I provided Sergeant Morrison with accurate information for all of his shots. The secondary engagement was conducted in a manner that supported rather than interfered with our assigned objectives. Morrison was studying the ballistic charts with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been challenged. The shot parameters you're describing, even with perfect calculations, the execution would require precision beyond anything I've seen. The trigger control alone, at that range, would demand perfection. Which is why I spent 8 months training specifically for extreme range shooting, Maria replied. The same training that qualified me for sniper school, where I outperformed everyone in my class at long-range precision. The same training you've been dismissing as irrelevant calculation work. Rodriguez was shaking his head with stubborn disbelief. Even if you made the shot, it was still a 1 in 3 chance. Success doesn't validate taking such a risk with mission security. Major Wells looked up from her intelligence reports with an expression that suggested Rodriguez was missing something important. Actually, Specialist Rodriguez, the intelligence value of eliminating Shepard far exceeded any risk involved in the shot attempt. If Sergeant Santos had missed, the worst-case scenario would have been revealing the team's position. But the successful elimination has provided strategic benefits that justify considerable tactical risk. Colonel Harrison was reviewing Maria's service record with obvious interest. Sergeant Santos, your file indicates multiple requests for assignment to advanced sniper units that were denied due to administrative requirements. Can you explain what that means? Maria felt a familiar frustration rising, but she kept her voice professional. Sir, the requests were generally denied because female personnel weren't considered suitable for extended sniper operations, regardless of qualifications or performance. I've been assigned to spotting and calculation duties despite demonstrating superior shooting abilities in every evaluation. The honesty of her statement created another uncomfortable silence. Morrison's team was forced to confront the reality that they had been working with someone whose abilities exceeded their own, but who had been relegated to a support role because of assumptions about gender rather than capability. Chen finally spoke up, his voice carrying a new tone of respect. If what you're saying is true, then your shooting skills have been completely wasted. You should have been leading teams, not supporting them. Morrison was struggling with emotions that were clearly difficult for him to process. His identity as the premier sniper in the battalion had been built on achievements that were now dwarfed by what his supposed subordinate had accomplished without recognition. Santos, Maria, he said finally, using her first name for the first time in their 3 days together. I owe you an apology. We all do. We treated you like equipment instead of recognizing your abilities, and that was wrong. Major Wells was coordinating with higher command through her secure communications equipment, relaying the details of Maria's achievement to officials who needed to understand what had occurred. The implications extended far beyond their current mission, potentially affecting training protocols and personnel assignments throughout the military. Sergeant Santos, Colonel Harrison said, after reviewing all available information, pending verification of your account, you've accomplished something extraordinary. The longest confirmed sniper elimination in military history, achieved while maintaining your assigned duties under combat conditions. He paused to let the significance sink in before continuing. However, we need to discuss the protocols you violated and determine how to handle this situation appropriately. Maria understood that her career was at a crossroads. She could be disciplined for acting without authorization, or she could be recognized for exceptional achievement that redefined what was possible in her profession. The decision would depend on factors beyond her control, but she had finally stopped hiding her capabilities. Rodriguez was studying the tactical display with a new expression. Ma'am, if Sergeant Santos can consistently perform at this level, then our entire approach to long-range engagement needs to be reconsidered. The tactical advantages of extending effective range by that much could change operational planning completely. Major Wells nodded agreement. The strategic implications are significant. If we can reliably engage targets at extended ranges, it changes force protection requirements and mission planning parameters across multiple operational areas. Morrison was staring at Maria with something approaching awe. I've been shooting professionally for 12 years, and I've never even attempted what you accomplished yesterday. The mathematical precision alone represents capabilities I didn't know existed in our unit. Maria felt a mixture of vindication and uncertainty about what would come next. She had proven her point more dramatically than she ever imagined possible, but the consequences remained unknown. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos stood in the same briefing room wearing the newly awarded Silver Star on her uniform. The decoration recognized her exceptional achievement under combat conditions and the citation described her elimination of a high-value target at the longest confirmed range in military history. Morrison's team had requested her as their permanent team leader, a recommendation that had been endorsed by every level of command. The men who had once dismissed her as a calculator now looked to her for expertise that none of them possessed. "The mathematics still seem impossible," Chen admitted as they reviewed plans for their next mission. "But I've stopped questioning the calculations when they come from you." Rodriguez nodded agreement. "I spent 2 weeks trying to understand how you made that shot, and I finally realized that I was asking the wrong question. The question isn't how you made it, but why the rest of us aren't trained to that level." Morrison approached Maria with a humility that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "Maria, I've been thinking about what you said regarding my dismissiveness of your capabilities. You were right, and I was wrong. I let my assumptions override the evidence, and that made me a worse soldier and a worse leader." Maria accepted his words with the grace of someone who had finally received the recognition she deserved. The shot that had seemed impossible was now studied by marksmen around the world, and her mathematical approach to extreme-range shooting was being incorporated into training programs throughout the military. But more importantly, the attitudes that had kept her relegated to support roles were finally being challenged by people who could no longer deny her exceptional abilities. "The next target is at 3,200 meters, Maria announced as she completed her calculations for their upcoming mission. "Well within our demonstrated capabilities." Morrison's team smiled at her confidence, knowing that they were now working with someone who had redefined the possible and earned her place through the most decisive proof imaginable.